Hello and welcome back to A Better World. This is your host, Mitchell J. Rabin, and I'm very glad you're joining us again today. Today we're going to be looking at some local New York City issues. The population of New York City is so international that it's hard to refer to it and think of it as a local issue, since anything that goes on here is affecting people in their respective countries across the world. Interestingly enough, if their families are experiencing something here, there are repercussions elsewhere. So that's just part of the cost and the excitement of living in an international city like New York. So to grapple with some of the issues, just a few of the issues we'll have time for today, is City Council member Dan Garodnick. A little bit about Dan. He was praised by the New York Times for his independent streak in his first year on the City Council, and he established himself as a leader in the fight for affordable housing, spearheading the $5.4 billion tenant-backed bid for the purchase of Stuyvesant Town and Peter Cooper Village, which ended up to be the largest real estate transaction in all of U.S. history. Actually, that's what it sold for. The bid that was brought forth by Dan Garodnick et al. Was $4.5 billion, which was still a very, very steep climb upward. But he did manage to organize this enormous amount of money on behalf of the tenants. With a background in civil rights and education advocacy, Dan Garodnick represented the Partnership for New York City in the landmark Campaign for Fiscal Equity lawsuit. Before joining the City Council, he also directed the New York Civil Rights Coalition's Unlearning Stereotypes, Civil Rights and Race Relations program in 42 New York City public high schools, teaching students nonviolent ways to combat racial discrimination and how to use the processes of government to effect social change. Additionally, Dan represented 13 same-sex couples seeking marriage equality in New York State and sought and received funding to rebuild African-American churches in Virginia, Georgia, burned by racially motivated arson. So it's really with great pleasure that I have Dan Garodnick on our airwaves again. He was on some time ago discussing matters of fracking and environmental issues that were and are different face, but still facing New York City at large. Dan Garodnick, welcome to A Better World.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure to have you on again. You know, when we look at issues facing New York City, any large city, there are many parallels between the municipalities across this country and elsewhere. One of the large issues facing virtually everywhere is this idea of a predatory activity of landlords who are always seeking to maximize their profit at the tenant's expense. You would think you were sort of in a bullfight or something. It's actually, the more I think about it from the point of view of A Better World, Dan, a very primitive kind of almost like a wrestling match. And I'm just awed that this kind of tension and conflict persists in what is otherwise a very sophisticated and in many ways civilized urban context. You've been active in doing taking various actions to sort of curtail this type of out-of-control predatory activity. Could you talk a little bit about what you're facing, what we're all facing, and what you're doing about it?
Absolutely. And, you know, I came to this issue initially in the sale of Stuyvesant Town and Peter Cooper Village, which you mentioned in your introduction, where this property and home to 25,000 New Yorkers, which is largely covered by rent regulatory rules, so rents can only go up by a certain amount from one year to the next. suddenly sold to the highest bidder after being a very stable middle-class community built by the MetLife Insurance Company, was sold, as you noted, for an extraordinary sum to a new owner who put together a deal which could only have worked if they were able to get these rent-regulated tenants out of their apartments as quickly as humanly possible. The deal did not work, and they knew it, and their lenders knew it. It would not work unless they could get these folks out of their homes. To me, that is core predatory activity where you borrow so much money. In this case, they had put down $1 billion and they borrowed $4.4 billion. That's B with a billion with a B. To be able to make the purchase work, and it made them necessarily have to go after people, get them out of their units, and try to bring the apartments to the market rate as quickly as they could. And what we've seen is...
You say, I'm sorry, I just wanted to bring this up. You say get tenants out of their apartments. So it raises a question, of course, certainly of ethics, but of simple legality. And it seems to me, and please correct me if I'm wrong or enhance it, that in order to get tenants who are living, as far as I know, legally in their apartments, to get them out requires something that is really illegal activity, such as harassment, such as possible deceit regarding their rent payment history or their legal claim to the apartment. I know even MetLife was doing this back in their day. But so here is a bank that is supporting, in effect, illegal business practices in order to arrange for them to get paid their loan back on a monthly basis.
That is it's a fair observation. Now, of course, they would not agree with the characterization that it is harassment or deceit or something illegal. What they were doing was using tools that exist in the law, claiming that people were not legally entitled to their apartment for one reason or another, and using that as a way to target individual residents and to try to claim that the residents, were acting illegally and to try to get them out of their apartment. So it was an entire business plan designed to take aim at tenants, get them out of their units, because when they did, there's a tool in the law which says once an apartment is vacant, then they could raise the rent rather significantly. So they had a very strong incentive to get people out in order to do that. And this was not, by the way, just a single bank doing the lending of this $4.4 billion. These were pension funds of Florida and California. It was the government of Singapore, the Church of England, and everybody in between. So this was a massive, massive real estate deal gone wrong, and you could have seen it from the outset. And one of the things which you did.
You saw it from the outset. So did I.
We sure did, and we took steps to try to compete in the marketplace to give tenants an opportunity to be the buyers and the owners of the property, and it was a rather extraordinary effort that we put together. And while we were not successful at the end of the day, we made it very clear to the real estate world that in the next transaction, they are going to need to be dealing with the tenants of town directly, and if they don't, obviously they're going to have a whole mess on their hands.
Exactly. That's something that we could call a net benefit from the entire rather extraordinary effort that you made with a number of cooperating law firms, and there were people on the ground. I think I remember there was either a pension fund or a labor union that were really getting behind your activity as well. So there really was a net benefit, even though it didn't clinch the sale. But since we're going so far in this, I'd like to ask you, Dan, because I was making a case at the time that since the city had donated these 80 acres to MetLife at the time back in the 1940s and offered them an extraordinary J51 tax abatement, didn't the city have some standing in who it was that would buy the property or designate it a landmark, type of status, or somehow intercede in the transaction?
Sadly, as a legal matter, it appeared that the city did not have the right to intercede, and therefore all authority over this transaction was a matter of moral persuasion and politics and influence, and certainly we at a local level pushed very, very hard to say to the real estate world that we were not going to tolerate these bad acts, and certainly we fought back at every turn after the property was sold. But we did not have, Mayor Bloomberg at the time, he said this is a purely private transaction. We are not inclined to get involved here. I strongly disagreed with that. It may be that as a technical legal matter, the city's rights to be able to influence the sale had evaporated, but I think that the city has a real concern on what happens to a property where 25,000 New Yorkers live, which are largely covered by rent regulations. There are huge public policy, affordable housing implications for anything that happens there, and that deserves an active mayoralty, and it deserves the attention of all New Yorkers.
Absolutely. That's why I want you to run for mayor.
Oh, all right. Thanks for that.
Definitely. Honestly, I think that that's exactly the thinking that Mayor Bloomberg, I wrote to him numerous times about this at the time, and I said you could stand up and be a hero and preserve one of the great landmarks, whether it's official or not, of New York. It is a template, our community here in Stuyvesant Town and Peter Cooper, to the rest of the country and the world for a thoughtful, consciously designed community, affordable, as you said, family-oriented, and not limited to that, but very much an integrated community for an urban environment, and you could do a lot to preserve its character here in the city. And
I think
he faulted. Yeah.
I think it's important to note that we're going to get another bite at this apple. And we are still as engaged as we have ever been as a community. And also, in my office, we're working with the new administration to develop a plan that will preserve Stuyvesant Town and Peter Cooper Village as an affordable haven for the next generation of tenants, and to continue to support the local tenants association's plan to ensure that people who live in the community have opportunities that they otherwise would not have had. So this is an ongoing conversation. I feel
ongoing. Okay.
We'll be talking about well beyond my term in office, I suspect.
Okay, fine, very good. No, that's very assuring to hear. I didn't know how seriously that was being taken, and I want to say on that note, to me, it's rather humorous in some ways, and I could say maybe in a little bit of a dark way, that the real estate bubble in New York City is so powerful. It lives within its own little world, and it forgets about the fact that, in this case, we are right, the entirety of Manhattan is flanked, of course, by two rivers that just a couple of short years ago, Dan, rose up and they started to flood our streets. And Mother Nature is way more powerful than a real estate bubble in anywhere in the country or world, for that matter. And so real estate values must be tempered by the larger environmental, climate change-based context in which we live. And I just find it so humorous that the current operators of, in this case, Stuyvesant Town, feel that they are somehow inured and protected from this larger, truly environmental hazard that faces us all of the time.
Well, there's no question. When you have a community anywhere in New York City that is bordering the waterfront and where you are subject to storm surge like what you've seen in recent history, that you are totally vulnerable, and that continues to be an issue in parts of my council district, certainly in Lower Manhattan, Staten Island, Coney Island. There's a lot of areas of New York where this is a real and live issue, and we've seen some federal funds coming our way to help devise plans to prevent storm surge. There are concepts being drawn up on how to deal with that along the East River, and it's important that we need to do something, because otherwise you face not only the displacement of human beings, but also enormous property damage, economic harm, et cetera. So this is a very real and live issue.
It's very real. Wonderful. I'd like to, before moving on to a couple of other topics, I'd like to just drill down a little bit further, if you will, regarding protection of tenants in the citywide. And I know because our show is largely dealing with national and international topics, I just want to say to the audience that you know that what goes on in New York is bellwether for the rest of the country, really. So while the names and faces may change a bit, the fundamental issues remain the same. And what I'm talking about here, Dan, is the destabilizing of apartments, which that turnover to be fair market value is, if I'm not mistaken, of relatively recent import. There remains, because of the Rent Stabilization Board, rather significantly high annual increases, certainly that began even before Bloomberg, but carried through 12 years of Bloomberg. So right now, talking about treading water, many of the tenants across New York, all boroughs, are up to their necks, up to their ears, really, in paying rents that are really not sustainable, legal but not sustainable. That's because the Bloomberg administration did nothing, almost nothing, to protect the tenants and the annual increases. Then there is the fact that when apartments don't go to fair market, the turnover increase is also very high. And one of the silliest things of them all, and I had the pleasure of speaking with someone on one of your staff in your office recently about this, is the MCI, the capital improvement, which is a wonderful idea on the face of it, except for the fact that the tenants have to pay for it even after the elevators are improved or what have you for the rest of their lives, instead of a year or 2 or 3 of amortization of the capital improvement, which is totally reasonable, and even the landlord making something on it, no problem, but forever. Could you?
Yeah, I mean, that's really, it's a mind-boggling loophole in the law, which allows, as you say, a landlord to make an improvement, put in a new elevator, put in a new boiler, and charge the tenants for it, put it on their rent bill, and once that is fully paid off, you would think it would come off the rent bills, but no, it stays on there forever, and it becomes an addition to your rent, and that's simply unfair to tenants, and it's something that deserves reform. And unfortunately, up in Albany, we did not see the reforms that we wanted to see to these rent laws to create more fairness for tenants, and that was one of the areas. We wanted to end vacancy decontrol so that when people come out of their units, their apartments can't be deregulated, which would deal with some of those predatory practices that we were talking about at the start. But also, MCIs, the major capital improvements, they should not stay on the rent bills forever. It's just not fair to tenants, and that really that needs to be addressed.
And what is the overall sentiment in Albany about life in New York City in this regard? I don't know why Albany is controlling it. That's its own issue. But what did you feel was the temperature? I know you organized busloads of people to go up there to demonstrate and show you their strength. So what is the sentiment there about
Mitch, if you're asking me to try to explain Albany to you, I'm sadly out of my depth. I cannot understand it. Do not understand it. Frankly, maybe I'm happy that I don't understand it, because what happened in Albany this year was a real disappointment, and New York tenants saw a real opportunity to reform these laws and to strengthen them, but watched as a deal came forward that did not include most of the priorities that we all had advocated for. And you're right, I was leading those buses. We were bringing up tenants and going to make our case, and sadly, it was not a successful year. But it's these battles will continue. The laws were renewed and extended, just not strengthened. But we need to do better.
We do. Where was Governor Cuomo on all of this, Dan?
Well,
Where did he stand?
He expressed support for a lot of the principles that I had noted for you at the beginning. But at the end of the day, they were not part of the deal. So it's hard to know when you have an assembly speaker and a governor apparently for the same things, and a brand new Republican leader in the Senate, how this was not part of the final equation. But I suppose that people have to suss it out, draw their own conclusions, and see where we go.
Yes. I've got to say, I feel like something has to happen that's different rather than business as usual in politics in Albany and New York. There's this same polarization that is always happening, and there is a movement afoot that is seeking to bring Democrats and Republicans and independents together in a new way, sort of an upgraded, progressive way of thinking, Dan. So rather than falling into the usual slots that we all know so well, that they really start with a new vigor to come up with a new form of politics that isn't polarizing in nature, but it's collaborative in nature. And along that line, in just reflecting a bit before having you on today, I began thinking about this, and I'd love to hear what you have to say. What if the City Council, in conjunction with Mayor de Blasio, decided to convene a gathering of landlords? I was wondering if it should be the worst landlords, the way the Village Voice used to document every year, or just landlords altogether, to seek to create a new environment, a new sensibility where being generous, this is going to sound funny, generous to tenants in any number of different ways was actually going to be more meritorious for the legacy of the landlord than business as usual, and almost to create I don't want to say a game, perhaps, of what landlord could outdo another landlord in being good to their tenants, in making sure the rents, besides even what the laws read, more reasonable. It sounds funny. A more beautiful lobby, for instance, nicer, greener grounds, rooftop gardens,
I like it. I like it. And, you would think that there is something inherent to trying to rent apartments to people and to encourage them to come to choose your property, say, over another option. That would create an incentive for you to want to treat your tenants well. But unfortunately, with a city vacancy rate for apartments at under 3%, there simply is not a lot of supply out there. So your options are limited, which puts the landlords very much in the driver's seat. So this is this is an unfortunate reality, and is very much the reason why we need to create more supply of housing, and we need to not lose the affordable housing that we have today. But your idea is right, and in a normal marketplace, that would exactly be what a landlord's priorities would be.
Yes. Well, thank you for entertaining the thought. Yes, I'm a bit of an idealist, but I'm also a bit of a visionary, and I do believe, actually, that our society at large is moving in this direction. In fact, quite honestly, I've interviewed the gentlemen, have started something called the Compassion Games, which were in direct contradistinction to the film The Hunger Games. And there have been numerous cities across the country, Dan, that have begun these initiatives of taking different actions to help the homeless, to feed the hungry, to take care of children, and all sorts of different, you could say, parameters which garner credit in the direction of winning the game on compassion. So it's very clever, and it is happening.
It.
You see, it really can happen. I'll get you more information on it afterwards.
I can. I'd be very interested in some more.
Wonderful, wonderful. So let me ask you, I know another issue that you yourself are dealing with is, since we're talking about zoning and I should say real estate a little bit, maybe we'll move into this, about Midtown East. This is, of course, a very local issue, and its development near NYU Medical Center, near Bellevue. There's an effort to bring possibly even the sanitation trucks to be housed there, which I think would be extremely unfortunate. And there's also mention of possibly greening that area, so because there's a dearth of green space there. Where do you stand with this?
So when you talk about the rezoning of East Midtown, you're thinking about an area a little bit further to the north of what you just described, although there is a proposal for a garage for sanitation trucks in the neighborhood that you were just mentioning. The East Midtown rezoning, though, is an area from 39th Street up to 57th Street in Midtown. And the premise there is that we want to do sensible growth in Midtown. We want to make sure that we get buildings and a district that has been known to be a premier commercial office district for New York to continue to grow and to continue to evolve, and not simply to be stuck in outdated zoning rules in New York City. And the reason why this may be of particular interest to your listeners, whether they're in New York or outside, is that we are developing models where we are tying development to infrastructure improvements. And we are saying to developers, as in a recent building on 42nd Street and Vanderbilt Avenue, if you want to build a bigger building, a commercial office building, fine, we will grant you the opportunity to do that, but in exchange, you need to put considerable sums toward improving our transit network. In this case, we were allowing a building to go through, and they committed, after we negotiated, to $220 million in infrastructure improvements to make the experience of the Grand Central commuter and Lexington Avenue subway rider better. And those improvements will need to be finished before this building is occupied. And if the cost of these improvements go up over time, it is on the developer to actually bear that risk. So it's a very good deal for the public, and one which is unprecedented in its scale, and it is unprecedented in its impact. So we're very, very excited about that.
That's good to hear. It sounds like there's the spirit of collaboration. You see, I mean, one of the unfortunate assumptions is that tenants do not believe that landlords should make money. And I think that's a horrible underlying, unconscious, inappropriate assumption. Of course they should be making money. They're bearing a lot of responsibility. The question is, how much? What's moderate and what becomes immoderate? That's where the issues lie.
Yes, and I think that one of the things that we've been able to show in this rezoning proposal is that we will allow for growth, and we will allow for buildings that will deliver more to the city in property taxes and economic activity, but we're also going to make sure that the public gets a good deal out of it, and that we're able to accommodate new workers who are coming in, and to make sure that we're doing our infrastructure improvements before we have all the new development. We've seen this problem not just in the Grand Central neighborhood, but all around the city, where you see sudden bursts of development and, families moving in, kids being born, and suddenly, the local public school can't accommodate the kids who are in the buildings in the area, and you have wait lists for kindergarten. All this is to say that you need to plan better, you need to do your infrastructure up front and anticipate what is happening, or as you see things happening, be able to respond and be nimble enough as a city to be able to fix these problems before they actually become problems. And that's what we're trying to do in East Midtown, and I think we are. I think we're going to have some great success.
Wonderful. Well, I'm really glad to hear that. That's very encouraging. In fact, you anticipated, but one question. Is the new building on Vanderbilt going to shadow Grand Central when it's in its fullest form?
It's not. Well, it's right next to Grand Central. Grand Central is, right smack in the middle of office buildings today, so it's not like Grand Central is getting a whole lot of sunlight. It may not even be getting any sunlight, frankly, directly on it. But it will be a large right next to Grand Central, which, by the way, to me, is sound planning for a dense urban environment. You want to put your densest office buildings next to mass transit. It's good for the environment. Yes. It promotes mass transit. It allows for density in a place that it belongs. It's a truly progressive vision of zoning, so. And also you can go a little bigger when you're right next to a low landmark building, because it creates a little bit of breathing room there. You have a big building right next to a very little building, so it helps to create a sort of a balance when you're talking about light and air.
It's a good point. I just thought of this. What if we had high rises that are now see-through? Just playing.
If you could pull it off, I think it would be brilliant.
That would be great, right? Lots of glass.
Glass. Nobody really likes these glass buildings, but I'm with you.
I know. Okay, it's a thought. Now, you did anticipate something else I wanted to bring up, which has to do with density levels and respecting infrastructure. And who is it, what agency in the city, Dan, is involved in monitoring what the density levels are, and water, sewer, garbage disposal, even demographics having to do with supermarket access, such as these? Who is looking out for access to transportation? Is there an agency that monitors this?
Whenever you do a new development that requires public approval, and it's a significant enough development that it has impacts like what you're describing, you as the developer need to retain and get working an environmental impact consultant to study the impacts that your proposed building will have. And then it's on, the public authorities, which is the Department of City Planning and the City Council and the Borough President and the community boards, to evaluate whether or not your building should be what you propose it to be, based on the impacts that you have identified. And that's, it doesn't create a formal requirement on you to do this or that, but it does require that you study and disclose impacts, and you leave it to the decision makers to figure out what that should mean about what benefits you should be granted.
Yes. You are listening to A Better World Radio with Mitchell J. Rabin. We're on every week here in New York City, although we are heard across the country and the world. And if you do not yet get our weekly free newsletter, please just simply go to abetterworld.tv. That's abetterworld.tv to sign up for that free newsletter, which announces our weekly Monday public community television show at 7 p.m. here in Manhattan, as well as our weekly radio shows. So make sure you become part of a better world community and family. Today we are spending the show with Councilman Dan Garodnick. Dan has an outstanding background of representing civil rights, educational advocacy, and is really, I say, a councilman for the people. And it's really with great pleasure and honor that, Dan, you're on today and speaking about these really very important things that I know you're very, very involved in and dedicated to. And I want to just say, just stepping back for a moment, even before you got involved in New York City politics, what you were doing regarding changing, unlearning stereotypes is a very high level of thinking regarding how to change and create greater integration between people of different backgrounds, different colors, races, creeds, etc. And that's a very high level. And then bringing public school education and government processes to help bring this about, I think is really a very progressive step. And I'm really glad to hear. Are any of these initiatives continuing today?
Yes, they are. In fact, that program has proceeded for a number of years. I had the privilege of directing it for a couple of years before I went off to law school. And you're right, taking those opportunities to get students in New York City to engage with one another across racial and ethnic and religious lines is something that you want to have happen, and too frequently people just isolate themselves and don't embrace people of different backgrounds. And this program was designed not to proselytize or put forth a particular sort of view of the world, but really to provoke and to get students to talk to each other across racial and ethnic lines and deal with some of the most difficult issues of the day, and also learn how to use the law and activism to affect social change rather than resorting to violence. And so it was something that I felt very, very good about, and it continues to be a priority of mine to think about ways to address the civil rights challenges of the day. I did, as you noted in your intro, sometime after I directed that program, there was a rash of African American church burnings in the South. And, there was arson suspected in many of these church burnings. And I decided to go myself as part of Habitat for Humanity and the Church Rebuilding Project to rebuild two of these churches, one of them in Southern Virginia and one of them in Georgia. And I went to religious organizations in Manhattan, and I said, this is important for us to stand up and say that we will not tolerate hatred of any form in this country. And I think it's important for you to sponsor me to go do this. And, report that Central Synagogue on 55th and Lexington said, we're with you. We think that's fantastic. You go as our representative. And so I went as their rep for about a month to help rebuild churches. And I think it sent a very strong message to the congregants, and also was an important message for the congregation of Central Synagogue in New York that was something that they were able and willing to do.
Absolutely. That is beautiful. Bless you. Unfortunately, here we are some years later when church burnings are actually continuing and going on in South Carolina, even after the horrific event that took place there, the massacre of 9 people recently. The church burnings get very little media attention, and yet they are, to this day, persisting. That brings up an entire subject of the relationship of the city and especially law enforcement with the people, and the way race has been figuring into this nationally, and that it would happen in a place like New York where color is in so many ways celebrated, all colors. It's just particularly hurtful and sad that we have such things as happened in Staten Island, and recently Rikers Island with the young man who was arrested and held in Rikers Island at age 16 for being accused of stealing a backpack, which it was found out that he did not. I mean, could you comment on the criminal justice system and law enforcement and what actions are being taken? I know some are. I know a lot of people in the police department really care about this. No one deserves, no department needs to be painted with the same brush. But there are things going on, that are just horrific. Love to hear.
I think it's a fair observation, and many of us were critical of where we were heading as a city when it came to the extraordinary numbers on stop, question, and frisk toward the end of 2012, 2013.
Yeah.
Those numbers are at a much lower level now, but we continue to struggle to ensure that there is a positive feeling between communities of New York City and the police officers who serve them. I think too frequently people do not recognize that police officers are there to protect and there to serve them, and rather view them as somebody who is somebody to be avoided. And some of that is is a cause of aggressive activity, and some of it is just built in to the way people have interacted with police over time. And I think that the key for us is to get to a better place where, based on training, based on the way that we deploy police officers in communities, and the way that we teach our students how to interact with police officers on the street, that we need to get to a better place so that everybody's sort of rowing the boat in the same direction here. You're talking about, before you were talking about people working together. This is one of those areas. When you're talking about police-community relations, you need community and you need police to have the relations that work. And I think that Mayor de Blasio is trying to explore ways to do that better with, cops on the beat and having more community or sector-based deployment, which I think makes sense. And as to the point about Rikers Island and the abuses that we have seen there, look, you got Rikers Island abuses which call for reforms, transparency, less segregation in solitary confinement, and more limits on how you handle prisoners as a general matter. When you are a prisoner in New York City, it is on New York City to keep you safe, whether you have committed a crime or whether you are simply accused of having committed a crime. It is our obligation, when you are totally and completely in the custody and care of the city of New York, to keep you safe and free from abuses. So that is a very important issue, and one which the federal government has taken an interest in, and one which we need to get straight. But when it comes to reform of these low-level offenses, I think that there are ways to redirect people out of the criminal justice system, so you don't simply have, young, poor people who can't pay bail and who were caught up in a very low-level violation sitting in Rikers Island for an issue that's going to get dismissed anyway. I think we can do better. I think we need to think more completely about how we address those sorts of issues, and those conversations are happening right now. You don't want to tie the police's hands. You want to make sure that they are able to enforce low-level crimes and make sure that they have the ability to approach people and to be able to ask questions and to be able to check identification as necessary, but even not loading up the jails on small potato stuff. I think that's an important priority, and one which would help us see fewer incidents like what you described a moment ago.
Yes. Well, thank you for that. I appreciate that. Is there such a thing in your knowledge, Dan, of quotas? This is a oftentimes discussed subject. As far as I know, it's officially denied that there are quotas having to do with things simply as tickets or arrests. In other words, that the policing behavior is measured quantitatively through these means. And to me, if that is the case, it is one of the most onerous and unethical and should be completely illegal practices. And what do you have to say about this? Is it true or is it not true?
I think what is definitely true is that police and agency heads of all stripes, they do measure the number of tickets that have been handed out. They measure the number of arrests that are being done. They measure all of these things because measuring them is an important management tool. Because if you see some employees, whether they are an enforcement agent of the Department of Health or Department of Consumer Affairs or a police officer, some who are bringing in certain numbers and some who are not. From a management perspective, you at least have to ask the question about what is going on there. The police and everybody else will deny that there are quotas being employed. I think it's largely the role of the City Council and the public to ensure that that is truly the case. But as a perspective of measuring performance and making sure that people are out there doing their jobs, there's nothing inherently wrong with that. The question is when, people are demanded to deliver X, Y, or Z, where it becomes an actual issue.
An actual offense. I agree with that completely. Measuring is itself an objective matter that, any agency, any business needs to do. And that's wholly appropriate. And the cost of that arrest and the cost of the issue of that summons and all of that needs to be quantified. But to measure performance by the number of arrests creates an atmosphere that is completely antithetical to the kind of city I think we, the majority of New Yorkers, really want to see. It creates the wrong relationship. And I'm happy to say that I think most people, most of the time, have a generally decent relationship with law enforcement based on what I see, and that comes from originating with the cop as well as the New York citizen. So I think there's a lot good that really needs to be acknowledged, and it's more the bad apple syndrome that I think that we have been suffering from and under the yoke of for some time now, and I really myself like to see that handled. And I do think, and I'm glad to hear, that there are initiatives, and I think the police commissioner is helping to really head that up. I feel that he is a humanitarian, and I think that's the right attitude. I maybe still, in a silly way, harken back to the old classic films of Officer McGillicuddy on the corner helping the old woman across the street. And, we laugh at that, but my God, that was a more peaceful time. And the relationship between police and people was much more settled and relaxed, and police were very, very helpful. And there have been shows on segments on things like 60 Minutes that have shown in different municipalities that kind of effort being made by the police to engage people on the beat in the community in a very, kind of a very honoring, respectful way. And it changes everything. It changes everything.
Yep, no question.
Yeah. So listen, we're almost out of time. I do want to ask you one other thing here, which involves the greening of New York. Truly, Mayor Bloomberg did much with the changing, creating bike lanes. I'm particularly sensitive to that as a bicyclist, and many of us appreciate a lot of those initiatives that occurred during his administration. There have been initiatives. One that I'm wondering about, is there anything that involves taking waste and instead of just plowing it into landfills outside of New York and New Jersey and Pennsylvania, or shipping it to China, which I understand happens, is there anything being done, Dan, about converting it into energy, usable electricity, so that things like the Indian Point power plant could actually be disengaged? Because for all it may be said how safe it is, there are many of us, and a lot of data support, that nothing nuclear is actually safe. And a tremendous argument has been made for decades about that. So, can you comment on this?
Yes, definitely. I think that finding ways to take advantage of waste to clean energy technology, and to include more recycling, composting, renewable energy. I think that we've come a long way in New York City to be able to to create a more sustainable environment. But in order for us to ensure that we are a truly green environment, a green city, we need to make sure that we have much more of our power coming from renewable sources. And as you point out, that will mean better air quality, and also the ability to close Indian Point with comfort and certainty that you are not losing an important power source. A facility which should be closed based on its safety-related issues and proximity to the number of people that it is close to. So, you are right to make that observation. And when I authored the city's first green energy code, it was with an awareness of this fact, and we need to build on Mayor Bloomberg's Plan YC and Mayor de Blasio's amended plan to continue to push these sustainability measures and make sure that they are really front and center for our city's priorities.
Wonderful. I love to hear that. And I'm glad you reminded me of your initiating the Green Code. That is wonderful. What was its premise?
The premise was 80% of our greenhouse gas emissions in New York City come not from vehicles, like in many other cities, but they come from our buildings. And so what this Green Energy Code said was, if you are replacing old systems in your buildings, you can't just go from an inefficient system to another inefficient system. You have to go from an inefficient system to an efficient system, so as to to protect the environment, save some money at the same time, and we made it into the law. And it was something which I was pleased to be able to author in my first term in the council, and has had a number of years to go into effect, and is working.
That's wonderful. I applaud that, and I can be of help to this city, not just through my work in media, but also my work in the green and sustainable renewable energy world. And I'd love the opportunity to sit down. I can really make some contributions in all of these domains. Because,
well, I appreciate it very much, and I appreciate that, and I appreciate your having me on this show, because it means a lot to have the opportunity to share some of the work that we're doing here, and we'll look forward to the next opportunity.
Absolutely. In closing, what words would you like to share with our audience?
Oh, I would say that we are looking to make sure that New York City continues to be a world leader, and one which is a fair city, a safe city, where we're not afraid to do big and bold things, and where people who live here understand that the rules will be applied equally to all New Yorkers, and where it's a very safe and comfortable place to come visit. And we hope that your listeners who are from outside of New York will continue to come and visit us. We're at record numbers, and it's because we have a lot of wonderful things to offer, and we continue to do really well in New York. So those would be my parting words.
Beautiful. Well, listen again, Councilman Dan Garodnick, a true pleasure to have you on, and we will continue this dialogue. I'll be in touch with you soon.
Thank you so much, and thanks again.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Bye.
That was New York City Council member Dan Garodnick, who, as I had mentioned, I am a real fan of. He is a politician for the people. And this just does not happen. You can tell by everything that he was sharing. His feet are firmly planted on the ground. He knows how to negotiate. He knows how to arrange, collaborate, and create goodwill between otherwise possibly conflicting parties. And if there's anything to the art of politics, that is one of its chief features. So I'm very glad to have him on and share his knowledge and his experience and his values with our audience. This is Mitchell J. Rabin for A Better World. I'm so glad you joined us. And as mentioned earlier, if you do not yet receive our weekly free newsletter, A Better World newsletter, it comes out only once a week. Please get on it. I write a blog in it often and announce our shows. It's at www.abetterworld.tv, abetterworld.tv, and I'm also pleased to say that we have recently become a nonprofit with a 501c3 designation to help us sustain ourselves. We welcome all contributions. I like to think of them as investments in a better world. That indeed is what they truly are, as we provide platforms for people, the sung and the unsung heroes of society, to let people know of the many good things. We don't shy away from the upsetting things or the truth. We care deeply about them as a means of coming up with creative solutions. They're abundant, folks, and we love to articulate them and share them here on this show. So thanks again for joining, and visit our website. Also, please send an email. I love your comments and feedback at MJR, my initials, MJR at abetterworld.net, abetterworld.net. And make sure to visit Councilman Dan Garodnick's own website as well, which you can get simply by going into the browser and putting in his name. It's right there. Okay, thanks again for joining, and we will leave you all with a touch of beautiful